What if I told you that one of the biggest wars of the year may have ended with neither side getting everything it wanted? For months, the world watched the United States, Israel, and Iran move closer to a full scale regional conflict. We were told the objective was to cripple Iran's nuclear capabilities, weaken its leadership, and reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. But today, a different question is being asked by many analysts. If the war began with promises of overwhelming victory, why did it end with both sides sitting at the negotiating table? Let's break down the timeline and examine what actually happened. Everything began in late February, when US and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against targets inside Iran. Unlike previous limited operations, this was the beginning of a much broader military campaign. According to multiple reports, Iran's supreme leader and several senior military officials were killed during the opening phase of the conflict. The attacks were described as an attempt to significantly weaken Iran's command structure and pressure the country into accepting new terms. However, Iran responded almost immediately. Instead of backing down, Tehran expanded the conflict by targeting U.S. military positions across the region and placing heavy pressure on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil routes. Within days, commercial shipping through the strait dropped dramatically. Energy markets reacted, oil prices climbed, and concerns about global supply chains spread far beyond the Middle East. At that point, the conflict was no longer just about missiles or military operations. It had become an economic crisis with global consequences. As pressure mounted, international diplomats intensified efforts to stop the fighting. A ceasefire was announced in early April, but it proved fragile. New military incidents quickly raised fears that the agreement could collapse before it even took hold. Despite those setbacks, negotiations continued behind closed doors. Over the following weeks, diplomats from multiple countries worked to keep communication alive. By June, both sides agreed to a formal memorandum outlining a framework for future negotiations. The discussions reportedly focused on several key issues, including the future of the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions relief, frozen Iranian assets, and the future of Iran's nuclear program. And that's where the story becomes especially interesting. When the war first began, public statements focused on regime change, decisive military victory, and fundamentally reshaping the Middle East. But as negotiations progressed, those objectives appeared to shift toward more traditional diplomatic issues: shipping security, financial assets, sanctions, and inspection mechanisms. For some analysts, that change raises an important question. Did the war ultimately achieve its original goals? Or did both sides gradually return to negotiating many of the same issues that had been on the table before the first missile was ever launched? To answer that question, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine how history has treated similar conflicts. Because once we compare this war to previous geopolitical crises, a very different picture begins to emerge. To understand why this conflict unfolded the way it did, it helps to step back and look at history. Military conflicts rarely end the way they begin. Governments often enter wars expecting quick victories, only to discover that the biggest challenges aren't always on the battlefield. They're economic, political, and diplomatic. The first lesson is about escalation. History shows that once a conflict begins, leaders often find themselves committed to decisions they never originally intended to make. Every new strike creates pressure for another response, making it increasingly difficult for either side to step back without appearing weak. We've seen similar patterns throughout modern history. Military campaigns that were expected to last days or weeks have often stretched into months or even years because neither side wanted to be seen as backing down first. The second lesson is economic pressure. Many people focus on missiles and military hardware, but economists often look somewhere else: the global markets. The Strait of Hormuz carries a significant share of the world's oil exports. When shipping through that corridor slows, the impact isn't limited to the Middle East. higher energy prices affect transportation, manufacturing, food costs, and financial markets across the globe. That means every additional day of conflict increases economic pressure, not only on Iran, but also on countries that depend on stable energy supplies. This creates a different kind of battlefield. Instead of tanks and fighter jets, governments begin worrying about inflation, fuel prices, investor confidence, and slowing economic growth. History has shown that economic pressure often forces negotiations long before military objectives are fully achieved. The third lesson involves alliances. Wars don't only test armies, they test relationships. Throughout history, allies have closely watched how major powers respond during crises. When security guarantees appear uncertain, regional partners naturally begin asking difficult questions. Can we rely on our allies in the next crisis? Should we strengthen our own defenses? Or should we begin building diplomatic relationships with countries we once viewed only as rivals? These are strategic calculations that often continue long after the fighting stops, and they may ultimately reshape an entire region more than any individual military operation. That's why many analysts believe the long-term consequences of this conflict won't be measured simply by territory gained or targets destroyed. Instead, they'll be measured by how governments adjust their policies, strengthen new partnerships, and prepare for future crises. Finally, there's another important factor that often gets overlooked: the public narrative. When wars begin, leaders usually speak in absolute terms. They promise decisive victories, historic achievements, and lasting change. But as conflicts drag on, those goals often become more limited. The conversation shifts from dramatic political objectives to practical negotiations about ceasefires, sanctions, inspections, shipping routes, and economic stability. That doesn't necessarily mean one side has won or lost. It simply reflects the reality that modern wars often end through negotiation rather than total military victory, and in many cases the final agreement looks very different from the promises made when the conflict first began. That brings us to the most important question. If neither side achieved everything it originally wanted, what does this outcome actually mean for the future of the Middle East? And who, if anyone, gained the greatest strategic advantage? That's exactly what we'll examine next. So, after months of fighting, where does all of this leave the Middle East? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain. Despite the ceasefire framework and ongoing negotiations, the region remains extremely fragile. A single military incident, a strike on commercial shipping, or a breakdown in diplomatic talks could quickly reignite the conflict. That's why many experts describe the current situation as a pause rather than a permanent peace. One of the biggest questions moving forward is whether diplomacy can achieve what military force could not. The negotiations currently underway focus on issues like sanctions, shipping security, frozen financial assets, and nuclear inspections. These are complex topics that require long-term cooperation, not just military pressure. History shows that reaching a ceasefire is often the easiest part. Keeping it alive is much harder. Another major question is how America's allies will respond. Countries across the Gulf have spent decades relying on U.S. security guarantees, but every major conflict forces governments to reassess their strategy. Some may strengthen military partnerships with Washington, others may choose to expand diplomatic relations with regional powers, hoping to reduce the risk of becoming caught in future conflicts. These decisions could reshape Middle Eastern politics for years to come. Then there's the economic picture. Even if the fighting remains limited, uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz continues to affect global energy markets. Oil prices, shipping costs, and investor confidence all react to instability in the region. That means the consequences of this conflict extend far beyond the battlefield. Families paying higher fuel prices or businesses facing rising transportation costs may feel the impact even if they live thousands of miles away. Perhaps the biggest lesson from this conflict is that modern wars are rarely decided by military power alone. Economic resilience, diplomatic leverage, public opinion, and international alliances often prove just as important as missiles and fighter jets. That's why analysts continue debating whether this conflict produced a clear winner at all. Some argue the United States and its allies demonstrated overwhelming military capability. Others believe Iran showed it could absorb significant pressure while maintaining leverage through its geographic position and regional influence. The reality may lie somewhere in between. Both sides paid significant costs, both sides made compromises, and both sides ultimately returned to negotiations. Looking ahead, the next few months will be critical. If diplomacy succeeds, this conflict could become another example of a war that eventually ended through negotiation rather than total victory. If negotiations collapse, however, the region could once again find itself on the brink of a much larger confrontation. For now, one thing is certain: the story isn't over. The next chapter won't be written by military press conferences or political speeches. It will be shaped by the decisions made at negotiating tables, in financial markets, and in capitals across the Middle East. History has shown us that wars don't truly end when the shooting stops. They end when lasting political solutions replace the reasons the fighting began. Whether this conflict reaches that point remains one of the biggest geopolitical questions facing the world today. If you found this analysis helpful, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe diplomacy can hold, or is another round of conflict inevitable? And don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the world's biggest political and geopolitical stories.